Okay, so I'm Jen Monroe. Like Nicole said, I have the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker, Mr. David Ludlow, today. Although I will say, after hearing Robbie's introduction last night, I was feeling incredibly inferior. So I'm going to try to do something that vaguely approximates the fabulous introduction he did. So Mr. David Ludlow is Associate Professor in European Smart Cities at University of the West of England in Bristol. And I'm going to do some of the standard stuff, but I've added a bit that will hopefully, maybe I made it up, but David Ludlow has extensive experience as an urban planner, first in UK government spatial planning agencies, and subsequently as EU project manager at the University of the West of England, where he's been responsible for securing and managing more than 50 EU-funded projects. In addition, David is a member of the EU Expert Group on the Urban Environment, which is the European Sustainable Cities Project, and the Expert Group for the EU Thematic Strategy on the Urban Environment, the 6th Environment Action Program. Okay, now some of the less standard stuff. David's work focuses especially on participatory frameworks that link community residents, planners, and city governments to shape urban environments together, co-creatively, as he'll talk about today, which he and his co-authors define in a recent publication in this way. Participatory governance is one such solution that aims to combine top-down and bottom-up engagement in urban policy formulation and implementation through increased stakeholder participation in the decision-making processes of government. I find this very exciting. This particular approach to smart cities then takes into account such variables as socioeconomic status, as well as population distribution and mobility patterns, as city planners consider alternative scenarios for development, but also, and importantly, participatory governance involves multiple stakeholders in the decision-making process. Ludlow has actively worked to develop participatory planning tools for the different urban scales and contexts that might help cities employ this participatory governance model. And something a little bit more off the cuff. I can also say that David Ludlow practices what he preaches, so to speak. And he is a kind and generous participant himself. David spent the entire day with us yesterday at the Student Symposium. And over the course of the day, I can say, and I think the students there will agree, that our conversation about how we might approach sustainability in our own work was enriched and quite simply made the better for his having been there. I'm not sure how David feels about parades, which you would understand if you had been at the talk last night. But if I were to host a parade, I would be quite happy to have David join me. The keynote address today is Defining Smart City Governance, Architectures of Co-Creation and Integration. So let's welcome Mr. David Ludlow. Turn this to you.
Lovely, thank you, Jen. Yeah, no problem. Okay, great. Thanks very much indeed for the introduction, Jen, and also many thanks indeed to Nicole and Robbie and all colleagues here for the invitation to come and make this presentation. I'm delighted that you're excited. I'm excited also, both by the presentation possibilities, but also by the issues. So it certainly is great opportunity, which we're lucky enough, I'm lucky enough, and other colleagues, a few of us are lucky enough to have a chance to get outside our own environment, if you like, of research and development and innovation actions, which is a lot of what we talk about in UK, in the European context and of our work, and to share that in a global perspective, because that's definitely part of the message about the global applicability and transferability, I suppose, of this work. That's what we believe. That's what we're excited about. That's one of the reasons I'm delighted to be here. And also to say hello to our other colleagues in Baltimore and Atlanta and Lima, and did I miss somebody? I think also here in Charlotte. So thanks very much indeed. What I plan to do is to make I think just to talk maybe for 40 minutes, because this is not going to be, not because, but and as well, this is not an academic exercise or presentation in the sense, you mentioned already, I started off my work on urban planning as an urban planner, working actually in the city where I'm living now. That was sort of by chance because I don't come from that city. It's not my home in a sense, and then working in different agencies in the region of the southwest of UK, then for a national consultancy agency, having the great opportunity to go in different parts of UK in as an urban planner and seeing very different circumstances of cities, and then going into academic work and starting an initiative which wasn't there at the time, which was about working with Europe, because we, in many ways, that sort of progress of the work to a larger scale, if you like, was already underway. So that was a bit of my personal journey. So what I want to do today, really, from that sort of perspective, if you like, practitioner perspective, there are no references whatever in this work. It's all it's all an argument based on various experiences and drawing a lot on practical studies of the work which we're undertaking now and recently. I say recently in the last 10 years, with cities in developing different tools to support urban governance in various ways, for driving sustainability in the planning of cities, and in various ways, aiming to support a more sustainable urban development, which is not specifically focused on any one dimension. It's not about social dimensions particularly, or indeed environmental, but looking more broadly or more holistically, if you like, about how we engage or how we deliver sustainability objectives in a spatial framework of city planning and what's involved in that. So that's broadly what I'd like to talk about. So there are some, as indicated here, some key propositions, if you like, some core arguments. Looking beyond that at then what we call what our technology partners call the requirements gathering part of it, part of the process. We need to learn a different language because we're working with our technology partners, so we're always, in a sense, and my role in that process of working with the other partners in our research, and it's pan-European necessarily because European Commission is encouraging us to work as we want to do with partners in all the member states of Europe, and indeed those partners are multi-dimensional in the sense that we work with a so-called ecosystem of partners working with cities as demonstrators, and they provide the requirements for the development of solutions which somehow are connecting or engaging or harnessing the dynamics which are very much evident today of social and technological innovation, and seeing how we can work with that. And part of that, of course, is developed by our industry partners. And then we have, in different ways, academic institutions, and a lot of our work is to do with, my work particularly, is looking at translating or developing a common language, some sort of common understanding, so that these very different groups within our ecosystem of partners, and also within, of course, the context of Europe, in which we have different traditions of urban planning and different traditions of and different cultures and different languages, of course. I mean, looking at how we can really work together in the most effective way. So some big challenges there, and so I think I hopefully reflect a little bit on that. And then really the latter part, I think, is just looking at some real-world examples, because that's what we do. We go into cities, we aim to fix something, and we move on. That's fundamentally the objective of our work. So that's fixing something for the purpose of more sustainable cities in Europe. But also the other key objective is, from a European Commission point of view, is building a new economy for Europe, supporting the development of these key industries of the knowledge-based economy. And the third objective is really building this community of research, of partnership within Europe, so that we, as part of the integration project, which is what European Union is all about. So we're working also partly ambassadors, if you like, for that sort of initiative. So all of those things are taking place in this activity funded by the European Commission. So I was asked to provide some ideas about what I would talk about here. And one of the things I didn't mention so much, actually, but I think this is the last point of the introduction, really, is actually the proposition of common problems and common solutions and common technological applications that we can apply globally in cities, in supporting the management of the cities, which, if we're right, and we're working on this, has huge implications, I think, because it gives us the potential not only, of course, for hitting those industry targets, because we can scale this up enormously if we can produce assessment methodologies, engagement methodologies, which cities throughout the world can use without, in a sense, affecting, if you like, the local specificity, I can't say that word, I won't say the word again, I don't think, the localness, if you like, of the situation. So looking at that relationship between, what can be globally assessed, if you like, and universally applied, and at the same time have relevance to local circumstance. That's our challenge. We believe it's there, and that's what we work for. And indeed, the European Union believe it's there because that's why they're using this vehicle of research and innovation action to support these engagements with cities and the development of these tools. So there are multiple objectives here, and I'll reflect a little bit on that, if you like, scalability, ability to reproduce issue towards the end, looking at some examples. So I think the starting point was that there is this dynamic of social and technological innovation, which is defining this new smart city governance in responding to these complexities of the city. And the background to the pressure, if you like, for innovation in this case is very much the way in which we're seeking an integrated understanding. So the whole essence of implementing a sustainable solution for cities in which we can, in different ways, if we wish, prioritize social, economic, or environmental. It's, I think we discussed yesterday, it's not so much the idea of a balance. We're not always seeking a balance. I mean, in the long run, yes, maybe, but if we're looking at operational urban planning, then we are talking about specific, if you like, neighborhood circumstances or citywide circumstances in which that notion of balance is not always the right objective. I mean, the objective might be more concerned in an impact perspective is to looking at alternative solutions that provide different options for social, economic, and environmental success. I think the key point is that we consider in that decision-making process on spatial development all those various key dimensions of sustainability in some process that allows us to make a good judgment about the trade-offs which necessarily exist in alternative development plans, if you like. But part of the conclusion from the thinking then has been it's really hard to do this integrated stuff. That's for certain. I mean, and we've tried, and part of the current thinking now and the drive for the open governance the open governance agenda, if you like, which is very much behind our current work for European Union, European Commission, is a failure of top-down expertise and the need for, not only for that reason, but for lots of other reasons, to engage more fully with, could be called bottom-up, but actually that's also a classification which is a little bit, maybe a bit rigid, because we're talking about multiplicity of stakeholder interests, which come in. So I think the simple opposition of top-down and bottom-up is not necessarily, the best one. But we've inherited that, so it's sort of, something that we're still working on the language, I guess. And so I think then the question I put here is that, how we can extend from the existing prime concerns or pre-existing concerns for integrated to a more integrated and participatory urban governance. How do we build the architecture of an integrated and participatory governance model? And what does it involve, et cetera, and how can we use the technology to support that? And then what does it mean in terms of our engagement with the social dimension? One of the things I should say, and maybe the reason why we haven't got multiple references in this work, is that an awful lot of what happens in our research is focused around the delivery of applied tools. And unfortunately, and it's a big concern actually for all of us, is that we don't have the funding for our work, if you like, for urban planners to do the necessary thinking that surrounds all of these issues, because in a sense, we have to go in with, we go directly into the engagement. We're talking with cities about what they do, and then we translate that to our technology partners. And in that process, ideas are developed, certainly about the evolution, if you like, and the progression of this governance model, but we are not given the funding, and indeed some of these funding actions are called innovation actions as opposed to research and innovation. In those, in principle, there's no research. So, we have to really just go in there and do things. And that, means that we don't, unfortunately, have, the chance to really deeply reflect on some of the things we'd want to do otherwise. So again, final part of the introduction, still talking about a new landscape. So we're now in this open governance landscape, and here we've got integration and participation. This of course is not to say that participation has always been part of the landscape of urban planning, but we're talking about a new ideas about openness, partly which is driven by the opportunities that are coming from open data. We had some discussion about that yesterday, and also the construction of because of the changing dynamic around the opportunity for processing information, looking and having open data as one source of that information, and therefore a new potential engagement with stakeholders outside the governance agency, looking at development of open process. And in other words, reconfiguring the decision-making systems, which are there at the moment. And again, we don't have the money to do that, unfortunately, but that's what needs to be done. So we're in that sort of new dawn, if you like, of viewing this landscape and trying to understand how it's working. This, of course, is driving expectations in various ways. And one of them is, and that's the excitement, of course, about we can see that we can potentially transform things in a huge way, not only applying these solutions globally, but also being much, much more effective in what we do. So good quality decision making with numbers attached so that we can make some direct comparisons. But also beyond that, and I think this is maybe the final point in this introductory part, is that we think that we're looking at the issue of implementation. How do we mobilize the political will for the often difficult choices that need to be made in transforming our societies in order to achieve sustainable development, which means doing things in different ways, and that needs political support. And at the moment we have problems with that. So the big belief or big hope here is that open governance and similar forms, if you like, of innovation in governance, decision-making and implementation modes around urban planning can in fact make a big difference in the implementation sustainable development. So looking at the proposition and core arguments then, it's a very simple story actually, I think. Complexities in territorial governments, it's a difficult and complicated world of intersecting socioeconomic and environmental dynamics with, and from an urban planning point of view, with a spatial framework of cities and neighborhoods and city regions, of governance agencies from local level to, in our case, EU, but federal level or national level or whatever, and with a time frame, of course, because urban planning is either something that needs to be sorted out today or tomorrow, and something which is extending 20, 30 years into the future. So all of those things matter. All of those things impinge on what happens in your backyard in various ways and with different directness, if you like, of connection. So that's complicated. So in order to address that, then we need, of course, integration somehow of all these factors in a decision-making framework so that our political masters can give us the authority to implement a spatial plan in a certain way which achieves whatever political objectives. Now, going back to the point I mentioned, I mean, so we see now, in some respects, this is seen as really too much for experts alone to do. It's hard work. And indeed, for all the other reasons I mentioned, the legitimacy surrounding an expert opinion solely on the future of our cities is not good enough anymore. So we have seen this emergence, and again, I haven't studied the literature, I'm sure, which is hugely fascinating, of the emergence of these ideas regarding open governance and how they've become, certainly in our research for the European Union, to become center stage of initiatives to improve urban planning in Europe today. I mean, this work and the work we're doing, luckily enough, is not a huge industry. I mean, there are only a few of us working directly on the issue of urban planning in this open governance framework. We work for an organization called DG, that's a Directorate General Connect, which is about technology connecting the communities. And there are just a few projects which are looking at this sort of work, and we're hoping and expecting that, you know, this goes on into the future, not only from our personal UK perspective of Brexit, which is problematic, you know, or may well be, I'm afraid, but more generally, whether the political priorities for the next framework program, which is the next research framework, will actually allow us to continue with this. We expect so, because it's so fundamental. But a lot depends on what we can offer to the Commission in terms of results, and we are working closely with the the policy officers and the project officers in DG Connect. They're very much engaged with this work. It matters enormously to them that we can, you know, identify realize, if you like, some of these potentials, because they're committed very much to pushing this agenda forward also. So we can see the new agenda then of open governance with this more emphasis on participatory engagement, and some of the things I mentioned already, and just focus on the latter part there, I think, about the effectiveness of the definition of the plan, of the process of engagement in the plan formulation and the process of securing a political mandate for it, and also in the implementation stage, based on the enhanced political will which we aim to secure from this process. So we begin to, and part of the way in which this is all characterized today surrounds the issues of transformational governance, transforming the way the cities are to become more sustainable cities, transforming the way in which we engage in the planning process, in whatever that means, in delivering that sustainable agenda, transforming the engagement of stakeholders and communities as central players, if you like, in that process, and surrounding that, or behind that, and one of the things that has been driving it is, if you like, ideas that have emerged in a few years ago concerning the idea of mass localism, in which and there are ideological backgrounds to this, but which are partly to do with, if you like, the sort of on the right, the ideas of small governance and engagement in the community and the community support for determining their own futures and so on. But again, that's not the main point of my discussion. Looking more at the technological side, I think, so what we can see is a huge increase in the potential of technology to support this governance process, and the ability of this technology intertwined with a social dynamic to disrupt, and that's one of the words that's used, to change, to alter, to force a revision of the governance model. And it's our objective, together with others that we're aiming to join with us, and that's an important part for me of being here today, to say we need you to join us in this, because at the moment we don't have enough urban planners who are working on these issues. It is very much supported by, from an industry perspective, our colleagues in the European Commission and DG Connect are in first principle engaging with an industry community. And whilst we are a necessary part of that ecosystem and that process of defining it, and even if the principal argument is for user-defined solutions, then the user community, the urban planners in that community, are unfortunately not strong enough at the moment to be able to really give it the push that it needs, even though we know that, and this has happened countless times, when the industry invents its own solutions, it typically finds that they're failing in the marketplace. They will not sell those things which are not properly based on a proper user engagement and definition of the solutions. And just to put it in a little, so that's even a bit of introduction, but I won't. I've got my eye on the clock, so I'm aiming to talk for another 15 minutes and then invite some questions and see how we go. Maybe that's if that seems okay. So this is where we are. This is the landscape of smart cities, if you like, and this was defined by Telefonica, who are a Spanish multinational smart technology operator in mobile solutions. But basically, we're at the city management part. But I mean, there's and this is not necessarily the most effective division, if you like. It's one way of looking at different aspects of smart city, if you like. But I mean, we do find that certainly in respect of what's being funded by European Union, that at the moment there are initiatives which are focusing very much around energy and environment and mobility, as well as management. And security and health is in a slightly different area. And then there's others concerning the economy. But those are, in a sense, they map quite well onto the if you like, the categories of research which are taking place at the European in the European framework. So if we look at urban, this is the core argument, the basic argument. It could be many ways of looking at this, but this is just one of them. So urban policy is being driven and defined by societal challenges. That's the name we give to the problems of cities in European context, and one of which is, of course, climate change. The policy behind that then at the European level is for a reduction, 80% reduction by 2050 as compared with 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emission. And we know at the moment, actually, current policy sort of is around here, and we need to get back right down there. So even though things are happening and we're doing a lot, it's a long way to go. And we're struggling to make it happen partly because we are struggling to deliver this policy in an urban context. Urban is a fundamentally important place where it has to be delivered, because in European context, 80% of the population is urbanized, living in cities. And many of these things, and these are the different categories of emitters, if you like, of greenhouse gas, are city-based or city-consumed, et cetera, et cetera. So the city is the place where we fix these problems. And that's an issue because we can't bridge the gap. We need to do things better. But and mentioning again the multiple challenges, so in addition to climate change, then we've got other issues, part of our societal challenge, which are concerned with finite resources and resource efficiency issues. And then, of course, there's the social dimension of demographic change, which is critically important everywhere, but also in Europe it's characterized by declining population, an aging population, and indeed a declining population in some parts on the basis of birth rates below replacement level, and issues concerning social cohesion, etc., which are of a different character, I suspect, from US, but nonetheless also some commonalities as well, I think. And then economic crisis. So these, and we still live in the shadow of that and of that crisis from 10 years ago. So all of these are big challenges for cities, for European cities, for global cities, and transformation of our governance model to be more effective is critically important. However, and what we see, and this is the part of the real excitement, is that when we line everything up in the right way, we can see that there are big opportunities for these so-called policy co-benefits or win-win solutions. And this is a very simple model based on the land-use transport relationship, looking at, sorry, I haven't got the pointer, but looking at the, if you like, the political alternatives of compact city and sprawling model of cities, which is very much mediated between transport and land use, of course, but getting it right in a sense, or that relationship, shall I say, then immediately is impacting on the quality of air and the emissions of greenhouse gas emissions, and that, of course, then is impacting on, and also the issue of noise in cities, which is another key dimension of European level engagement in city planning in Europe, but also affects in different ways. Urban sprawl is indirectly, if you like, influencing the biodiversity of cities and the biodiversity of the adjacent ecosystems, et cetera, et cetera. And then these then follow on in terms of impacts. These pressures impact on the climate change factor, on the health of the population. According to this DPA SIR model, which is adopted by the European Environment Agency, and it may be that you work with very similar, if not indeed the same model, but it's basically looking at drivers and the pressures and the impacts and the responses. In other words, the planning policy. What is our response to this? Understanding it and then responding to it. But getting things in the right way, then we can see that we can actually simultaneously, and I had some figures, I didn't include them here, but in which we can see that by for example, reducing non-motorized transport by a certain degree, we can simultaneously meet our greenhouse gas emission targets because we've reduced motorized transport, improve the quality of air, reduce the consumption of energy. All of those things align in exactly the same way. So, so that's the win-win policy co-benefits opportunity. We need to understand how and measure, be able to measure more precisely than we can at the moment what those relationships are, so that we can know that we're doing the right thing, and actually we can be much more convincing in a political arena regarding the right way forward. And that's part of the problem at the moment, because there's a lack of a really clear understanding of these complex interconnected issues. So I think that that's probably the key message from that. And then from that, and this is much more generic if you like, we can say, well, what does planning need, urban planning need to improve to be able to begin to move towards an improved assessment of that along those lines? And, well, these are some of the basic components, if you like, which partly are the things that we can do. There are no doubt things that are not here that we're not addressing in our work at the moment. But, I mean, certainly information intelligence and communication, the ICT provides a huge opportunity in that respect. Assessment methodologies, yes, integrated assessment, integrated impact on a spatial basis of, for example, greenhouse gas emissions, of alternative plans for development, visualization of future forms of the city, simulation of the future of the city, simulation and visualization as methods of communication with stakeholders, but not only, but also with government agencies. Planning involves a multiplicity of agencies that need to collaborate and have a common understanding in using complex information, some of which is rather specific, if you like, subject specific, or rather discipline or agency specific. And therefore, visualization and simulation can be powerful tools for developing a common understanding between those different planning agencies. All of that's supported by the technology. So we look at these, if you like, the process of intelligence supporting communication and assessment and affecting the decision-making aspect. And the principles then, and this is where immediately we can look at sustainable development. This comes from the European Environment Agency, because of course those principles need to be set within a conceptual framework, and the only conceptual framework fundamentally is one of the Sustainable Development Integration Framework. This comes from the European Environment Agency. This is using slightly different words for the three categories, if you like, because it's looking particularly at the green economy. And so it talks about the ecosystem perspective and words such as produce capital and human well-being. But essentially, it's the same normal or standard and familiar concepts of sustainable development. And this is a key point, then, I think, in respect of how we move forward from these generalized ideas, if you like. How we operationalize, I mean, how do we bring all of this into focus in an operational way? In other words, how do planners use this information? And this is key to understanding what sort of technological tools we can apply in what way in this planning process, and what opportunity there is. I mean, essentially, we work with the policy cycle. It's a generic planning cycle. It's not specific to urban planning, but this one is. But I mean, as a general planning cycle, it's simply saying, you know, we've got a problem. What's the nature of that problem? What can we do to solve it? Into urban planning, of course, how do we get stakeholders and political support for that solution? How do we implement it? And then we monitor that implementation and say, well, did it do the job or not? And if not, then and of course, in the legal framework of certainly European and UK planning, there would be an ongoing iterative process, if you like, of plan revision over time. So all of these things come in as, if you like, as requirements from an urban planning point of view for potentially enhanced information and intelligence and communication around those issues. And this is how it's visualized. This was some work that I did with colleagues from the International Society for Local Environmental Initiatives based in Freiburg in Germany, Italy. And we did work for DG Environment about 5 or 6 years ago in operationalizing and looking at how different groups were engaging or understanding this process, if you like, of urban planning. And then it had some different names, but essentially the same. And then we were talking about the baseline review, the initial starting point of finding out what the core problem is, and then moving on through target setting, the same words really: political commitment, implementation, and evaluation of the results. So that's the sort of ideas around, I think, the requirements of urban planners to address more effectively this integration issue and the participatory aspect. And then Open governance then, which is, if you like, more of the current work, is very much concerned with, well, the open governance paradigm, I mentioned already, is driven by open data, but also looking and involving the questions surrounding open systems and the development of a governance model, a decision-making model, if you like, with a more open engagement facilitated by open data, but also by these other processes that I've been describing, which can enhance the governance of the city. It's not just about open data. It's one of the initiatives that we have. There are a whole variety of initiatives going on, but it's characterized in terms of this open governance, which is very much driving in, if you like, then the participatory aspect, stakeholder engagement in decisions, open process, more transparency, more accountability, and more democracy, more options, more ideas into the planning process. I mean, so, and all of which can arguably deliver effectiveness and better quality of urban planning. Much of this agenda is the agenda is set in a generic way in the funding streams around public services. We apply it in urban planning, and that's part of the reason why that we don't have a whole range of projects addressing urban planning, because it is the call text itself is actually generic around public services, and as I said, we focus on the planning aspect. So the framework here of thinking then, I mentioned already, is open data, open service, open process, which is open governance, if you like, and from that we are getting this enhanced transparency and collaboration and participation as an opportunity that we have to define and utilize and mobilize. So this is also where the agenda of co-creation is coming in, because we're talking about stakeholder engagement in working together to define and deliver and implement an urban plan according to the principles of sustainable development. And some of the ideas, and don't want to repeat too much here, but I think certainly collaboration with societal actors, i.e. The citizens, the stakeholders, the community, who are experts, of course, in their own territory. I mean, this is not about experts and non-experts. It's about different expertise applied in a co-creation environment in order to solve problems and define solutions. So I think that's a key point in respect of the backstory, if you like. This is the policy cycle again, but here the key issue, I think, is that when we intervene with different sorts of potential social or technological innovations into enhancing that policy cycle process for the purposes of improved urban planning, that certainly in terms of the initiation of the process, I mean, what is critical is that we can have an engagement at this level, in which ideas are, and then it's the community's expertise coming into defining the problems and solving and defining the solutions, or looking at the process of defining solutions together with the other agencies. But typically, in a sense, at the moment, the stakeholder engagement is at this point. In other words, the experts have this domain. This is the expert area in which planners will decide what the problems are, and devise a plan of solutions around here to be then put forward to the public for acceptance, both with the community and with the political body, which is part and parcel of the same process, essentially. The argument here is that we must bring the community, the stakeholders. Co-creation must allow for an engagement at this initiation point. Otherwise, the solutions are not owned in the same way, and therefore there will be more opposition, a potentially longer process of urban planning, and indeed a greater chance of failure of the plan to implement the solutions, because they're not in principle not belonging to the community. And so I think very quick run through then some projects, some real world examples, some really great stuff here. This is the exciting part. So here we are, lots of projects going back before smart cities were invented. It goes back to, well, 2000 and more than 10 years, starting working with the European Space Agency. They wanted us to work with satellite data, which we did very happily. And also other major projects, integrated projects, this Humboldt project, in which we had a small part which was concerned with urban planning, working with, I think, about 20 million euros and about 40 partners over a period. It went on for actually 4 years. This was looking specifically at the global GMES, what's not used anymore now, but it's the program for satellite supporting the European Space Agency's satellite program through the development of applications, part of which was concerned with land monitoring, and part of that land monitoring component was concerned with urban planning. And so that's where, from initial work with the European Space Agency directly, some of these same ideas are still appearing in work which is indeed just finished, this project just last month. So it's an ongoing initiative, but it's not all about space, and it's not all about satellites, that's for sure. In this process, I mean, these are the organizations we've been fortunate to work with. I mean, a whole host of cities and industry partners and research agencies throughout Europe. And so far, mostly, almost entirely throughout Europe, because of the funding regime, if you like. It's fundamentally focused around European research and development, but increasingly, I think we have opportunities for a more global engagement, happily, because we do believe that, and there are enough people also believing that we can develop solutions for cities throughout the world. And also because I think some of the funding mechanisms are opening up to those possibilities. Very quickly, actually, on this, because what we do is, in a sense, we develop what we call policy stories or policy scenarios, which are means of having a way in which we can talk with our industry partners, talk with our city partners, to have a common understanding. It's built around an urban planning assessment. You know, in other words, the policy is looking to implement a green infrastructure, which has a number of characteristics, which we identify in terms of a strategic planning framework for the city. For example, blue and green are fundamental strategic planning objectives, planning frameworks and planning opportunities for cities. Connectivity is key. And looking at the way in which that connectivity is disrupted in various ways is also vitally important. So Urbis project, using from space, so all done from space, using primarily automated process. In other words, very efficient in terms of producing the intelligence and information that it does produce, gives us a chance to look at these issues. This is one example of green solutions, developing and supporting policies to implement green infrastructure in cities for a whole variety of objectives concerning biodiversity, but more active travel possibilities, opportunities for cycling and walking, recreation, and also for new economic potential for opening up neighborhoods which are currently, for whatever reason, not so accessible. So that increased permeability of the city is really important, but we don't know where it is. That's the problem. So this is the space shot, which with the appropriate processing allows us immediately to find the green, and then we can begin to, because this is GIS-based information, we can then analyze that. So we can undertake analysis of the percentage of green, different types of green, the connectivity of the green, et cetera, to build and support the implementation of the green infrastructure plan. We can, beyond that, and this is where it gets really interesting, We've got the same assessment methodologies applied to all the 700 big and medium-sized and gigantic cities in Europe, but not so many really big ones, of course. And so we can see, using this very simple, and I can't do this, but I mean the methodologies for assessing the green, using the data from space to assess the green potentials. And we can see here, this is Vitoria-Gasteiz in Spain, former green capital of Europe, but it actually is a very green place and has, against the European average of green, which is the red line, a high potential. And indeed, it's engaging in delivery of that potential very well. Brussels, on the other hand, does actually have a lot of green, but its green potential is very much lower. So we can make those direct comparisons because the data is harmonized across all the different planning sites. So already we're building a common urban planning tool that can be applied in all European cities. And indeed, these assessment methodologies, although we haven't applied them beyond Europe yet, the argument is they are, of course, equally interesting in the European context. This is very different. This is not from space, but this is also Vitoria-Gasteiz. And here we're looking at how we can engage with the community in realizing the potentials of the central part of Vitoria-Gasteiz, which is it's the capital of the Basque region of Spain, but it's also is a center for car production. So it's a working class town, and it's built in a rather, I guess, 1960s, typically Spanish high density, but really rather bare and unattractive. So the question from the planning point of view is how can we improve that, and what sort of improvements should we take place? And this is a very simple model, but basically using a technology for interactive manipulation of this visualization, so that it's possible. I can't do it here, I'm sorry. But in other words, we sitting down together with the community in a typical planning meeting, if you like, but using this as a way of reimagining the local environment and getting some consensus around what was important and what was less important in that environment. So producing a transformed landscape. They also have a wonderful tram. They've got a green infrastructure on the tram line there. And I didn't mention, but actually, apart from the cycling introduced here, reducing the space for cars, so that it's calming the cars in the locality, and also actually bringing back a river that was flowing along the edge of the street here, which was culverted in the past, and bringing that back so that, re-establishing a natural environment in the heart of the city, which is what people wanted. And this is Antwerp, and again from space we can detect the efficiency of insulation in the houses of the people, and then this is being used by Antwerp City as part of their campaign to promote insulation in the loft. So you can immediately see, what the block is, the residents know where they're living, of course, and this you can see is a hotspot of poor insulation. And so providing a very visual means of promoting the policies of the city regarding energy efficiency and so on and so forth. This is London, another partner. These are all partner cities we're working with. Again, from space, looking at light emissions. Again, the potentials here are very much about the campaign, about how we can promote and raise awareness about the problems that are surrounding this sort of situation. Obviously, a major city, you expect there to be a huge amount of light spill, but nonetheless, having an awareness on a citywide scale of where the key hotspots are, if you like, then gives a big opportunity for urban planners to communicate with the with the emitters, if you like, and see where, in fact, maybe it is possible to make improvements. This one this was developed through a Decumanus project using satellite data. But I mean, here was the objective was to using a supercomputer to localize the IPCC model of climate change. So this is looking at climate change impacts at the local level, and again, visualizing and representing in terms of potential health impacts, all of which are connected in different ways with the climate change and the changing temperatures in cities over time, up to 2100, in fact. And also assessing air quality. So again, in this case, in Madrid and in Milan are using this as a means of raising awareness, engaging with the local populations regarding the implementation of their strategic plans for the future of the city and the city region. This is one of my favorites by far. This is a great example of using mobile technology. It's not from space, well, indirectly from space, mobile technology to log the movement of people. And what we know here, and essentially the argument here, is that we know everything about the spatial frame of the city as it is today. We know every detail of the physical form of the city, both above and below the ground. We know virtually nothing about how people move in cities. So we don't know the socioeconomic dynamic of our cities. We have very crude methods of finding out how people move around and so on. This allows us to track the movement of people. It's anonymous. It doesn't know who you are, but it tells in aggregate over time how people interact. And this was applied at a city scale, and we looked at the movement of people in and out of the city on a daily basis. But you can see that, and the great thing about this is it gives us the opportunity then for to model environments using this data. So we can take, understand what we understand about specific urban environments, the spatial form. We can model different forms. We can zoom in on the urban park, for example, and look at the interventions that might come about by park improvements. And we can see from examples already how people interact in certain environments and model those in different configurations of spatial form. Okay, sorry, I'm talking too much. I have to stop, and I will stop. Just to say, this is simulation in Bulgaria, and one very final point, because I think this is the key. This is the urban atlas. This is the satellite image that tells us the planning framework for Barcelona. This is based on satellite images, the same sort of images I've mentioned previously, and gives us an urban plan, basically. It gives us a GIS base for urban planning. This base is now being developed for these 700 cities of Europe. All urban Europe now is mapped on that common basis. We have a harmonized basis for urban planning throughout Europe. We're developing the tools which will allow us to operationalize that urban planning base, if you like, because all of those things I've mentioned in respect of integrated assessment, particularly, can have a strong application in this sort of framework. And that's important because it gives the chance for urban planners that don't have access to the best opportunities, good assessment methodologies which they wouldn't otherwise have. It gives us a reference framework for the whole of Europe as a benchmarking, if you like, for understanding the way in which cities in different contexts are operating or not operating. So that's it. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry I did go on too long, inevitably. This is Bristol, by the way, on the same basis. So thank you very much indeed. And maybe I'll be delighted for any questions.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
So, I'm not sure how to do that.
Where are they?
So we'll take questions from other sites first because they have to.
Sure.
Me.
Oh.
Christina, is this something we can do? Something's happening. Oh, great. Is this Peru? You can't see. I can see him back there, but oh, there we go. Hi, we see you. Do you have a question?
I think that's
Yeah.
Baltimore, if you want to call
Is that Baltimore? Baltimore. Do you have a question? You look poised with a question.
Is here. We don't have any questions.
Oh,
Okay.
no
Okay.
questions.
That's
Okay,
good.
great.
That's good.
Do any of the sites have questions then? Atlanta, Lima? If not, Charlotte will take all of the time.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Is that us?
That's you, but I don't know where you are.
Oh, I'm in Atlanta. Thank you.
Okay, great. Atlanta.
Yes, I do have one question for you. What is the impact of capitalism on that idea of open governance and its ability for major policy change? When you talked about, particularly when I take a look at your declining of carbon emissions, you know, the whole idea of capitalism and all the underlying issues that surround that have a significant impact on the ability for that slope to continue to go down. So what impact does capitalism have on the ability of open governance to really affect major policy change?
Okay, so it's a little bit difficult to hear you. I don't know if we can get a little more volume, Christina, but I'll try to recap the question and tell me if I'm mischaracterizing. But what is the impact of capitalism on open governance? Is that the gist of your question?
Yes, the
Okay.
impact of capitalism on open governance and its ability to affect major policy change.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. I mean, that's a great question. I mean, yeah, sure. I mean, you have to bear with me because I'm not going to define capitalism. So let's just talk about, if you like, for one thing, the stakeholders that surround capitalism are in principle, you know, equal partners in all of this, and in co-creating the future of the plan. I mean, we know, of course, that you know that development and the investments surrounding, if you like, the created by the development industry are totally key to the development of our cities. Urban plans are there to orchestrate, if you like, or animate, or encourage, promote, according to certain political objectives, the development process. But I mean, they don't have the money. They're not the initiators in that sense of development. So capitalism is a key stakeholder. We, in principle, within our assessment methodologies and our engagement process, look to secure the right sort of engagements for all stakeholders in that process. We had this discussion, actually, to bring it down to earth a little bit yesterday, I think, in our role-playing exercise, when we were looking at the way in which the developer came into the community with a proposal. And I was conscious, and it's nothing new, in a sense of the unequal relationship. And I think behind, you know, between, on the one hand, the dominant capital interests and the inability of communities to secure the futures that they desire. And that, in a sense, is, of course, the whole basis for participatory governance, because we think that that's inequitable. That is, you know, communities are not happy about that, but the community doesn't have good enough voice. So we're looking, that's part of what we do, I think, to address that issue. But I think it's also beyond the issue of, if you like, equal rights to engage in the process. We need certain, at the same time, certain requirements from a, if you like, from a legal point of view in the planning process that you know, make sure that community opportunity is not lost. And we had a good example yesterday, again from Detroit, about how that's working. Also in UK we have so-called Section 106 agreements, whereby in certain circumstances, development value must be invested in community things, and so that's all part of that relationship, I think, in terms of engagement with capital and so on. So, I suppose in that sense I see nothing new, but we need to look at that relationship, and I suppose we're aiming to harness or strengthen the hand of the community in that negotiation process regarding the future development of cities and their own neighbourhoods, bearing in mind that capital, in a sense, will be the initiators of that, whatever change takes place. And yeah, so maybe that's all I can say, without going on too much.
Thanks. Atlanta, do you have any other questions?
I have a question.
Is this
Can you hear us?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, fantastic. You said in your talk, open governance is facilitated by open data. And we had, under former President Obama, a federal government executive order on open data. And I'm just curious, as we look to some challenge to open data, government open data in the United States, whether you're experiencing any similar concerns regarding the Urban Atlas, for example, with Brexit. I'm just interested in hearing you talk about this issue of governments, federal governments, often being the source of the data that we all want to use, and the ability of political changes to impact the access to that data. Do you understand the question?
Maybe do you want to recap?
Yes, so your question is about the source, governments as a source of open data, is that correct? Did I mishear you? I'm sorry. He said in his talk that open governance is facilitated by open data. So I wanted him to talk more about that issue of open data during a time when, at least in the United States, we have open data to federal government data through an executive order that was under the former federal administration, the Obama administration, and now we're seeing those executive orders being rescinded. And I'm interested in that issue for the U.S., but also to the extent you're seeing that in the European Union, where you're reliant on the Urban Atlas, which is an EU project. With Brexit, is that challenge? And just that whole idea of how we are reliant on big federal governments to gather the data, and if you have changes in administration, the challenge that might create.
Okay, thank you for the question. I'm certainly not an expert on open data. I'm sorry for that. Open data. So what my understanding of how this works then is that we will happily, in the sense, I'm talking about the guys who are responsible for making these assessments regarding impact in the framework of specification of the best solutions for sustainable development of our cities. We will take data from any source. I mean, anything can, in principle, be utilized. And right now, we are hugely inventive in the sense that we have a massive heterogeneity of systems and data. That's partly why we want to move away from that, because it's so complicated. Everything has to be sort of crafted to provide local solutions, if you like. So, I mean, it doesn't need to be that way, and that's a really expensive way of doing urban planning. And we don't understand what our neighbours are doing. And indeed, with the example of Bristol there, I mean, that plan, sorry, just to divert slightly off the issue, but it's an important point. I mean, that city of a functional urban area of Bristol of 1 million people is divided into 4 administrations who work with different systems. And so there is no interoperability, if you like, between the different agencies responsible for the planning of a single functional urban area of Bristol, and that's not unique at all in Europe, or in UK or Europe. Only with the Urban Atlas, that's the only way I can get a harmonized view of the planning framework for my city, believably. And I go to Copenhagen to get that. So it's not available in Bristol. Okay, so it sounds like I'm really vulnerable, but I think as regard, I mean, there's a huge number of issues surrounding open data, many of which has to do with, you know, the concerns about security and privacy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know the state of the art on this, to be honest with you, at all, and I certainly don't know the situation in the US at all. But I don't think that we have at the moment a concern for right now where we are for the loss of the potentials coming from this Urban Atlas system, because of course our systems in UK planning are not based on this at all. I mean, we're talking about the future potentials, and at the moment, and we were talking about the research and innovation actions in our work and others that can build on this platform, if you like. And so that's really, I suppose, where we stand right now. I mean, in going forward, if we do become dependent on these things, then I guess like any system, then if you're that dependent, you need to make sure that you've got some good backups and fail-safes, you know, to ensure that you're not vulnerable to the loss of it.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from Atlanta or Baltimore or Lima? I know you need to move to another. Do we have any questions then here in the room here in Charlotte? We have about 5 minutes for questions. I know you've all had to wait. We're not going to let you have salmon until you ask at least one question. Yes, you too.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to thank you for the nice presentation, and specifically about the integration of stakeholder in addressing sustainable city management. And you gave an example about Detroit and the other city. What do you see as prospects in the coming year to have this integration happening in several cities in the world? Do you see that's something easily feasible, or we still have a lot of challenges on our way forward? Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I just recap the question from the other side?
Yes,
I don't know if the other sides heard it, but just to recap, what C2 was asking is, what's the likelihood that this approach will be implemented soon, here in the United States in particular, but around the world as well? Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Actually, the soon issue is that's a really difficult one, of course. I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, I'm pretty sort of positive person in these respects. I can't see any way going forward that we will not be transforming the way we manage our cities because of the opportunities arising from this data. I mean, and we don't do this, and we'd love to do this, but if you examine any other innovation process over time, then you end up doing things in the least cost way, the most effective way, arguably in government agencies. I think so. So we've got that process. I mean, we're building the model. We're looking at the potentials. We're experimenting with cities around these issues. We're doing it, but it's happening globally. And the same issues are addressed because of the common problems, because of the common drivers of change, because in urban planning, the potential for common solutions is absolutely there, not in building the park in a certain way, but in assessing the impact of social, economic, and environmental in spatial framework, so that when I ask the question, which all planners do we go for site A or site B? In the political process, that's a choice. And we have to say, well, what's the benefit of this and what's the benefit of that? We need some clear understanding, which is according to a common methodology that allows us to make those assessments. We believe this does exactly that. It will put numbers onto those things which at the moment don't have numbers. It gives us a chance of making a direct and reliable comparison between alternatives in which political choices can be made. You can have these number of jobs, but it's going to cost that much in terms of environment or social impacts. And that really matters. But at the moment, we're in a fog. We don't know. And what we believe then, very much, is that these common assessment methodologies will come because the opportunity is there to make huge savings in the way in which we run things at the moment. And cost is such a massive driver in this business. It's very expensive to plan cities. And so the opportunities there, I think the motivations are in place. Timescale, I don't know. Honestly, that's almost impossible to say, of course. But surely it's the future, and if you look at the way in which and I'm not saying this is necessarily the best indicator of that argument or supporter of that argument, but you look at the way industry piles into this business of smart cities, including our part of it, smart city governance, then they can see potentials as well. And other researchers in other parts of the world are coming to the same sort of conclusions. So I think, yeah, definitely it's the future.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great. One more question.
Thank you so much for all the information you shared and all the data. One of the questions I have is, what do you see? How have you overcome, or what is your input on how you engage communities that are challenged in getting them to the table? I always call those communities, I call them, they're in survival mode. So how do you get their input to be included in the data, but also to understand it, to be a part of that planning process? What suggestions do you have to help us become better successors at doing that?
Yeah, I mean, if I understand, I mean, I think that's probably, I mean, for me, community engagement, I mean, the whole stakeholder engagement is the biggest opportunity and the biggest challenge. Because I think we can do the integration stuff. It's going to happen. They're going to build a machine that will do it. That's not a problem, because in a sense we don't need people to be involved in that process in the same way. Whereas the the participatory part is hugely important because going back to the idea that we've got to make these, overcome these hurdles of transforming the way we live. We need to do things in different ways. Otherwise, we just can't make it work in terms of, the targets we've decided that are important to meet, and indeed are built in European context targeted. Cities need to perform in this way. It's not an option. It's not. So we can't opt out of that. But I think getting citizens involved, which then for me is fundamental to defining the political will for that change that we need, is then the biggest and most important thing. And and I don't know, honestly. I really honestly don't know whether it can work the way we don't get the chance to study it at all. It's completely off the radar in terms of what we do in our work, unfortunately. Whilst despite the fact that it's so important. And but certainly in terms of, if you like, transitions regarding how can we, because I mean what we do know is that we're not going to bring in these systems for using technology to engage with the people to replace other things. We need a multiplicity of forms of engagement that, of course, meet the needs of people in different ways. And I think we had some mention yesterday, very basic, if you want to sort of discuss with the people, go and meet the people, so don't do it in the town hall, don't stick it just on the internet, so we need to be sensitive and aware and, in designing the future improved systems, if you like, exactly what people need. But, beyond, but my worry is people have got another, their life is not urban planning. They're concerned about what happens in the neighborhoods, of course, and not in my backyard and not in my backyard are key issues. But beyond that, the other key issue, of course, is the future of the city. Over 20 or 30-year time plan, and whether we're shaping our cities to be, a sustainable city or not, really, because it's just business as usual, and we go on in the same way, which is going to be problematic, even more problematic going forward. And how we get people really to be wanting to be involved in that, I'm not sure. Surely we have to just throw an awful lot of things at it from lots of different directions, way beyond what we do, that's for sure.